questions about what's happening, and procurement, feedback and complaints review, risk management, and implementations of recommendations. These are the main themes that public hearing will concentrate at. Public Accounts Committee will introduce themselves. Deputy Ina Gardiner, Chair of the Public Accounts Committee.
Deputy Christina Maud, Vice Chair.
Deputy Karen Wilson, Member of the panel.
Deputy Raluca Kovac, Member of the panel.
Deputy David Wall, Member of the panel.
Vijay Kakria, lay member.
Philip Taylor, lay member.
Thank you, Hope, lay member.
Graham Phipps, lay member.
Thank you.
In attendance, Lynn Hammond, the CNAG.
Andrew McLaughlin, Chief Executive Officer.
I'm Sebastian Perez. I've got the lead liaison with the PAC and CNAG and the systems around improvement arising from the relevant reviews.
Okay, thank you. And we'll start with the first questions, and I'll start with the general checking in. What changes have you seen since your time in the role, and what has been the hardest change to implement since you've been in the role?
Just for clarity, do you mean since 1st July or?
No, since you started to work as interim for the...
Before my interregnum. Biggest challenge is trying to instill prioritisation into the system. Biggest surprise is that prioritisation wasn't seen as a priority inside the system when I arrived, and that might be the interplay of the political system with the public service, but I think, as I've said here and other places before, I just felt it was an organisation which was additive, kept adding things, but hadn't really invested leadership time in prioritisation and how to address the need to prioritise things if you want to get anything done. So that's been the biggest challenge, and probably the biggest surprise as well coming in.
It's interesting that you're making prioritization. I think public and ourselves, we hear lots work prioritization. How would prioritization work for you? How do you prioritize? What's the process?
There's different ways of doing it, different techniques.
How you're doing it?
How I'm doing it in if we take, what's the best way to describe it? So one way to do it is to try and make sure that you've actually got the resources to do the things you want to do, in very simple terms. And what I observed was that the organisation had more priorities and aspirations than it actually had the resources to deliver within the time frames it thought it was working to. So my approach to that very much is to then go through a series of pyramiding exercises with those leaders, in some case with elected members, to try and pyramid down to, of all those things you really want to do, what are the things that are most important to you and what are the things that are most important to the organisation in the island. So to, through workshops, work through with people, what do you really want to do if you accept that you can't do everything? So the first part of it really is to try and figure that out. So focus on, if we're talking about, say, the Council of Ministers, focus on the programme of government that they want to pursue, focus on the big goals within that. And when those are understood, then focus very much on whether you have the resources or are likely to have the resources to deliver them. So then I look at the four big levers that you've got, which is money, obviously. Have you actually got the money to do all those things in the time available? People, both the availability of people and the capability of people, this sort of human resource management. So with the LT, we've run numerous workshops on the budget. We've run workshops on people and resources. I would then look at, particularly for the sorts of things we're trying to do, the availability of, in shorthand IT and technology support for the things that you want to do. Have you got the resources available? Can you line them up? Then I would look at legislative time in the case of a government. Have you actually got you know, how much legislation can you actually pass in a good year? And have you given yourself enough time with the number of laws and law changes you potentially would want to make? So when you go through it on that basis, making sure that your resourcing and planning lines up to your priorities, that to me is prioritisation. Once you've done that,
But the
you can then
question, if you're
focus on
basing it
tracking.
on which evidences you are basing your prioritization, or on what you are basing your prioritization? I understand that we need to prioritize all the time. If it's values, if it's risks, if it's fun, what's
well,
Let me just clarify
Yeah.
that question a little bit further, if I can.
Yeah, sure.
You started off by saying you're gonna go around and asking everybody what's important to them. But when you're listening, what is it you're looking for that's the most important things that you can then give them guidance so that you can actually have a basis, I think, what Ina's saying. What are the most important things to you leading that drive prioritization?
Well, the example I was using is, for example, the prioritisation around this government coming up with its CSP. We may as well use a live example rather than any example. And of course, one of the things that's different about this job from previous jobs I've done, of course, you've got a permanent civil service, but you've got elected members who have priorities they've been elected on, and they want to turn those into a programme of action. It's kind of my job, amongst other things, to do the best job I can to advise them as they pull those goals together, and also to make sure they're capable of being delivered. So that's the work I was describing there. And you know, it's up to them to decide the priorities. They will do that in the way that they publish with regards to their vision for their CSP, with regards to the risk register, with regards to all of the normal inputs that you would have, the inputs from the CNAG and others on what's important to islanders. So it's up to them to work through what that list is. It's up to me to try and work out whether it's capable of being delivered and what decisions we'd have to make to try and give it the best possible chance of being delivered.
Okay, what organizational changes are currently planned?
Currently planned? Nothing's currently planned, I don't think, that hasn't been announced. So we've got a leadership change in 2 departments. One caused by a medical procedure, but there's no other ones that we've, unless I'm missing something, no other ones.
So if we're already mentioning that the chief officer for HCI is standing down because for the medical procedures, and we wish him good recovery, can you please advise if the Tom Walker was announced as an appointment for, is it temporary appointment
Interim, yeah,
or
interim.
it's also interim?
Interim, yeah.
Okay, because, so it's interim appointments. Was the process that he's been appointed, was Jersey Appointment Commissioner was involved, and the process of the appointment was endorsed by Jersey Appointment Commissioner?
So once we understood the situation we were facing with the incumbent and their situation, and once I understood and spoke with the incumbent about what was happening in the role at the moment, also understanding what's planned ahead in terms of some of the work of the ministerial team, it was my recommendation to both the Health Minister and the Chief Executive that that probably the best equipped person in the current team, if we were to go for an interim solution, would be Tom. So that was my recommendation to them. I didn't deal directly with the Commission. That would have been, I think the Commission dealt more with the Chief Officer for People Services. But yeah, it was endorsed by them.
But my understanding, no, was somebody got in touch with the Jersey Appointment Commissioner, and if you have it in writing that the Jersey Appointment
Yeah,
Commissioner
the Chief People
endorsed,
Officer, that's what I just said. I
Yeah.
just said that's the Chief People Officer. They did that. I didn't do that. They did that.
they did that, so you did go through the process. Was the position open for other expression of interest? If anyone internally can apply and say, I would like to be interim chief officer for health?
On this occasion, no, because of the sort of unique circumstances all of it and looking at what else was happening in the department, it was my advice to the Chief Minister and the Health Minister that Tom would be the best candidate from the existing team.
Okay, because it's actually unorthodox, because it's the first time, I'm not sure if it's right or wrong, just the observation that it's first time that we have a person who is not has a background in the medical profession, it's a generalist. And the question, how it would support the health department, would it be advantage, disadvantage, how you see that we have a generalist and not professional in the area appointed as an
I
interim
get
chief
the question now.
executive?
It's more about why rather than
Yeah.
why that person. Really, I would say 2 reasons, maybe 3, but one reason was as the Health Minister's outlined, is in the foothills, his ministerial team are in the foothills of trying to create a new structure for health, which I know he's discussed here. I think he discussed that the health scrutiny panel. When you look at that so-called whole system health structure and pulling that together and bringing the different constituent parts of the system together, I think there's a lot of policy and politics in that process alone. And I felt Tom probably had the skills and expertise to support the ministerial team during that transition period over the next number of months. So that was one reason. There's a second very practical reason, in that Tom already had the line management of public health and the health policy team. So he was already very, very familiar with parts of the brief and parts of his team, obviously, work in health. I also felt that his experience going back a ways in, I guess, what was then called social security and other places with the health, and I felt that all of that relevant experience probably meant he was the best fit for an interim period. That being said, it's very important, and I think this is well understood by the ministerial team. It's very important that while their new unitary structure may take a while to bring together in its entirety, I think everyone recognises that with Chris hopefully being available to us again early in the new year, but due to finish anyway under his contract next
In March.
it's quite important that we pay particular attention to the appointment within the new structure of the senior leader for the secondary healthcare sector. So we felt in that context and with the months available to us, and with the expertise we had in the existing senior team at the hospital, we felt that was a manageable risk for us, and actually there'd be more good than harm from having continuity and that deep experience of the rest of government. That was my thinking in recommending it to the
How
Health
long
Minister.
do you think he will hold this position as interim, and when you plan to go to the permanent recruitment for the chief officer?
I don't know the answer to those 2 questions. I don't know the answer to the first, therefore don't know the answer to the second, by which I mean they are beginning to consult on that structure. It's not clear yet at what point they'll move from consulting on the concept to being very specific about asking for role profiles and a full organisational design to be erected, which would then trigger the appointment process. As I said at the start, all I've done with both the Chief Minister and with the Minister for Health and his team is to say, however that process runs, and I accept it's a bit unpredictable, we need to pay particular attention to the senior role within the hospital in the new structure, which is not equivalent to Chris Bowen's role, but has substantial elements within it.
So we are going to have organisational changes.
Well, yes, so I thought you were meaning ones that I was sitting...
You're initiating, okay.
that hadn't been announced.
No, generally, I was asking about
yeah,
organisational changes. Anyone has questions around this area before we move on?
Could you just explain how long you've known about the chief officer's situation?
Which chief officer? Chris
For
Bowen?
health.
For health? Oh, well, I've known that he had this issue, which may or may not require the treatment it's now going to get. So I've known he's been managing that condition. I would imagine since I restarted in July, certainly I've known about it from then. But obviously with conditions like this, at some point a decision is made that you can't see it through rehab and rest and so forth, and you need an operation. I think first indications of that may have been 3 weeks or so ago from memory, that actually is going to require a period, is going to require a scheduled operation this autumn, and that being off, I think all parties were hoping there might have been a way through
So
without
it was
having to have the
before
operation.
restructuring proposals were being considered or during?
Well, the Minister for Health, and you'll have to ask them this, and I'm sure Health Scrutiny did, I think he made his first public speech regarding his concept in June, and he'll have been doing his research and work to arrive at that point really during the course of the second half of the winter. So the prospect of structural change as an option, as a policy option, has been known about for some time. It's only been clarified very recently in terms of what it would actually look like in terms of consultation beginning within government. So
Yeah, on the structure point, I would like to
I don't
ask-
think there's any relationship between the two things, if
Okay.
that's what your question is. That,
Yeah. On the structure, it would be very helpful to understand, because it's not just the minister deliver the structural change himself. He's supported by the officers and officers during the consultation and presenting option to the minister that minister will be able to decide. So there is a connection between ministerial and the civil servant working together to do this restructure. Can you indicate timeline when we will see business case for restructure, or anything that we can say, okay, this is the way the restructure would go? When we will have the first presentation, or approximately, is it 3 months, 6 months, year and a half? How long this consultation and planning for restructure of the health will take place in your view?
Well, the consultation's begun in earnest by the Minister, and I think it's up to him to give a timeline if he's able to give one. My understanding would be that it's partly dependent on how they get on in the consultation, but clearly none of us, I think, have an interest in something that takes so long that it starts to feel like a permanent state. So I think I can't give you a specific timeline today on it.
But yeah, about your expectations as the chief officer, you
My-
have
my
organization
expectation-
to manage.
Again, what I've done, as you'd expect me to do, is to make sure that I've got interim arrangements I'm comfortable with in terms of the officer I've put in there, make sure I've covered all the contingencies, because there's uncertainties over how long Chris will be out for and so on and so forth. So all I've tried to do is make sure I cover that risk as best I can. I don't have a specific time for when the consultation will end and what happens. One thing I want to clarify with is, although I didn't speak to the Appointments Commission, the Chief People Officer
Yeah, I
did,
got it.
and got approval. So we didn't move ahead without approval, for
Sure.
avoidance of doubt.
No, thank you for clarification. It was made clear at your answer. We'll move now to the,
Sorry,
yeah.
just one last, it's a really a clarification point, because you started off about the issue of prioritization. And then I believe you said you get your prioritizations directly from the ministers based on what their needs are, and then you respond to them. So I just wanted, that sort of explains what's happening here as well. But I just wanted to clarify, did I hear that correctly?
No, I think when I was asked the very first question, what my
Yeah.
answered in terms of prioritisation, the example I was using is how prioritisation worked in practice to support ministers as they put together their vision and goals, which is including the CSP for government. Obviously, there's a whole estate of BAU activities in addition to the things that they want to change in this term of office. There's all the things that they've inherited which must run smoothly as well. So my priorities would go wider than that. But I was just using that as an example.
I just wanted to clarify how that worked.
Yeah.
I'm not disagreeing with it, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, we'll move to the next section.
Yep.
It's a question about procurement and use of consultants.
May I just quickly?
Yes.
A quick question. If you could just describe the role of the civil service in delivering what I think you've described this morning as a project of restructuring that's led by the minister. Well, it's his idea, so how is the civil service supported?
I'm not sure I have. The minister's obviously made a public speech in his, I think, brief health scrutiny, that one of his policy options as the health minister is to try and create a unitary health structure, a whole health system, as he calls it. How much actual restructuring of the services as opposed to connecting of the services that involves is an open question. Yeah, if that's a policy priority.
What resource have you provided for that process?
Oh, yeah, I've got you. So again, in terms of the role of the civil service, the health policy team will have supported them in developing those proposals, as you'd expect. He'll be working with the health team, Chris, and members of his team to try and make sure that they come up with something conceptually which is likely to be effective and well received. So it's the normal role of a permanent civil service to support ministers with all aspects of advice, including maybe advice that's harder to receive as they develop their policy proposals. I mean, that is one of our jobs, not our only job, but that's one of our jobs, and to do it impartially.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we do move to the procurement, and the procurement procurement review that we launch and questions will be into 3 different parts. The first part will be led by Deputy Kovac around from the submissions from Chamber of Commerce, Institute of Directors, and the Construction Council that we received, and issues that were raised in that submissions.
So this is a theme that came out strong from different departments and different organizations, and hence having a separate procurement review as well. That's why we're touching now on it as well. I'll start by some feedback that we received, together with some quotes from the minister. So the Minister for Sustainable Economic Development stated in the Assembly on the 10th of September, I have serious concerns about the process in procurement and how they make it difficult for local businesses to access procurement, the time it then takes for responses to come back. What are your plans to address concerns expressed by the Minister at the state sitting?
Well, thank you for the question. And one of the joys of this job when you're relatively new into the organisation is looking at all these areas once you get questions about them. Procurement's something I'm familiar with from other places, but I'm getting up to speed as it relates to the public service in Jersey. I'd say the first thing I'd say is I was very pleasantly surprised about how successful local suppliers are in our procurement processes, which is slightly at odds with the narrative of some of the submissions. But obviously I've experience of other large organisations on this island, and to find that, before you make any adjustments, to find that over 50% of what we procure, which is about £260 million, goes directly to local suppliers. I thought local suppliers were doing way better than I thought they were going to do, quite frankly, given the scale of some of the things that we have to purchase. If you then look at the non-island suppliers, and I know you've got last year's list and hopefully this year's list will be out soon, then really you could adjust that by taking out some of the specialist off-island health suppliers, because clearly we're never going to have a big locum contractor supplier in Jersey. Really, adjusting for some of those big health contracts, local suppliers are getting up for 60%, 2/3 of winning the business. So I, for one, was pleasantly surprised by that, at how much business they were winning, despite all these issues that you've surfaced. It's more than they're winning from other big organisations on the island. So the government is doing a better job of procuring locally, I think, than many other organisations of remotely comparable size. And yeah, I was surprised and delighted when I saw just how much business they were winning.
Okay, so talking about the local suppliers and how easy it is made for them to actually access this procurement system, still the Minister for Sustainable Economic Development mentioned it can sometimes take months for local business to hear back. saying, then I have heard various examples of never hearing back from the government. It is taking months and months and months, despite the small business having spent perhaps a week or 2 weeks dropping all other work in order to do the tender process itself. And this is similar feedback committee has received from the Chamber of Commerce, Construction Council, and Institute of Directors. So can you inform the committee why it's taking so long for businesses to hear back regarding their procurement tender and what's being done to improve this process?
Yeah, so I think, again, I'll reiterate, if you look at the top supplier list, you'll see it's dominated by Jersey firms. So obviously some businesses are able to enter the process, win contracts, and build up very substantial relationships with us. Obviously, if you don't manage to do that, I guess you'll have your own story to tell there. I think from looking at it, where I think there might be, there's a couple of things to say about this. In general, at most governments, not to say that we can't improve it, what sort of things are we doing? I think
But sorry to interrupt, why does it take so long to receive responses to their tender
it's
process?
difficult without looking at the individual cases, but for sure we have a small dedicated team on procurement. We have, for example, if we look at the issue of some of these complaints people have got about the process, we've got 4 colleagues who are really dedicated to onboarding people onto the systems that we use for procurement, helping them on board, training them, helping them get used to it in terms of tendering. And we've got another 2 colleagues who really help people on the payment side of that in terms of faster payments. Whether that's enough or not is a kind of open question. That's the resource we've got. We don't have any plans at the moment to increase that resource. I want to be clear about that. But we have, 7,000 suppliers. So it's quite a waterfront for them to cover. In terms of how we procure, I've had a good old look at this again because you've given me the opportunity. I think when you're looking at how we procure, which might give rise to some of these issues, it's quite important that you try and move in with people and understand what's happening in real time rather than be a smart aleck based on looking backwards or having facts that they didn't have when they were operating at real time. And I think when we move in with them, there's areas of procurement for larger stuff they do very, very well. I think the most sensitive area are those medium-sized contracts, which I think they're called for below 100, below 100,000. So any contracts below 100,000, which are small contracts for a large organisation, but they're obviously very important contracts if you're a small organisation, if that makes sense. In that particular area, from as best I could tell from the submissions that I've been able to see, that's where a lot of the noise is. Small and medium-sized companies trying to get those smaller pieces of work. The process we've got there is a lot of that work is reactive, by which I mean a need presents itself fairly quickly. Could be something to do with the storm and infrastructure, could be something to do with roads, for example. And when it comes up in those contracts area, we seek 3 quotes. There's no secret list or anything like that. We seek 3 quotes, we put them through a framework, and out of that framework, a winner emerges. I think a lot of the complaints are around that area of our work, and that's probably the area of the work where we've got the most improvement to do. I was delighted to see the Minister for Infrastructure launch the ICE initiative a few weeks ago, because a lot of those complaints come from smaller contractors in the construction sector and various aspects of facilities management. I think as a government, we've got to try and do a better job of giving visibility of the work that's likely to come in those smaller contract areas, particularly if it's not reactive work, giving more visibility of the likely levels of spend to give them more certainty. So that's why we're doing that work, obviously, with the Construction Council and others. So in terms of the noise, I'd say that's the area where I think we've got the most work to do. When I look at the bigger stuff, the 100+ stuff all the way up to the SAP type purchase, that is very consistent with what I would see in private sector organisations. So it's maybe further down, we've got to be a bit more, I'd say a bit more careful about how we communicate and how we make things visible. My one worry in saying that is that, and this is another reason why we have to prioritise, in the past, we have had situations where a lot of that procurement is reactive. Something's happened and we've had to get something done quickly, or we've had cash overruns, or we've had all the issues that I've spoke to you about before, which means money starts to go out the door very quickly as the year end approaches, and people start spending it very quickly. And I'm just worried that in those historic practices, that's where we've maybe not got things right. So that's going to be a focus going forward for the procurement services team we've got.
Okay. And to pick up on what you said, in order to better improve this, you need to look back. How do you manage the feedback around this? So I'll state again the submission from Jersey Chamber of Commerce, which says the general consensus is that government of Jersey procurement is broken, serving to act as a barrier to business being done, rather than something that enables local businesses to provide valuable goods and services to our government and ultimately local taxpayers. The Minister for Treasury and Resources stated in the Assembly still on the 10th of September that wasn't aware of this. So no, I was not aware of that feedback. We have done considerable work, which is outside the scope of this question, to continue to improve our procurement processes. Can you please advise the PAC what the process is for collecting feedback on procurement and how is this filtered into the government?
Sure. I mean, the first thing to say is I've read that submission, and obviously I've done as much homework as I can for coming here. I don't recognise that characterisation of our procurement. And I'm happy to go and see the Chamber and explain to them in detail why I don't recognise it. As I said at the top, if you adjust for those big out-of-island health contracts, which this committee is very familiar with, somewhere around 2/3 of the money this government spends on procurement goes directly into local suppliers and multiplies through the local economy. The Chamber's submission is not consistent with that fact. It simply isn't.
But their submission is based on the feedback they receive from their businesses. So what are you planning to do to address this sentiment?
So it's anecdotal, it's not factual, but these are important feelings that are in the community. I'll definitely go and see them on that point, because I don't recognise that characterisation. In terms of how we gather feedback, as I said, we've got obviously a small procurement team. I think the Treasurer, were he here, would accept that in the changeover from the transition out of OneGov and the Chief Operating Office structure that was set up and all of that history into Treasury and Corporate Resources, he's been in a period over the last 18 months of rebuilding capability and quality in that team, because obviously we had some people depart, which is well known. So I think there's things that we're doing, obviously rebuilding that team. We've got those 4 colleagues who are focused on interacting with businesses and picking up on these concerns. If some of the organisations who are directly funded by government, by the way, but if some of the organisations who have submitted to you think that more can be done to help businesses interact with government, I'd be delighted to see what role they could play in that. I think there's a role for Jersey Business. There'll be a role for Digital Jersey. So if businesses need help, in general, we've already distributed grant money to organisations whose job it is to help business. So they could put their shoulder to the wheel. That would be fantastic.
Okay. Checking with the members if somebody would like to follow up.
I have given we're doing a review of procurement, you've talked about the proportion that goes to local businesses, the difficulty of doing it for smaller contracts for local business.
Yeah, there's sub 100,000.
Standing back, I know you like the big 5. What would be the big 5 improvements you'd make to the overall system, or that you may be looking to implement?
On the system, on the procurement system, yes. in the narrow, definitely one of them would be zeroing in that sub 100 that we discussed, because I think the process above that's kind of industry best practice, I would say. And I've looked at things like SAP procurement to see if it's what I'd have expected to see in other organisations, and it is. In that sub 100, definitely focusing in there, trying to find ways to be less reactive or less short-term in the way that we procure. I know that's not always possible in government, hence the work that the Minister for Infrastructure is doing with the construction sector. I think we could extend that to other sectors. So that would be crucial. Certainly with the team who are really focused on interacting with these businesses who are tendering or who are seeking payment, I think there's a team where we're going to do a bit more detailed work on customer experience and how to handle customers, how to handle what are de facto complaints or actual complaints. That's something that we may talk about later. That's something we'll be doing a concerted piece of work on with planning. I'd want to adopt the same approach to this team because they definitely need some help dealing with this incoming. So those would be the sorts of things in the very short term that we'd really want to look at. I think one of the things that's going to help is the wider prioritisation exercises. I think, as I said to this group before, the problem in government in the recent past hasn't been cash, although listening to the FPP yesterday, it might soon become cash.
Yes,
but it hasn't been cash. There's always been enough cash. It's actually been lining up the rest of the resources so that you could spend the money well. That's how we've ended up in trouble in consultants, I think, and in poor procurement. So I'm hoping that as we, over time, pull the capital programme and the other spending programmes back to something that's realistic for the island, that will then give everyone the time and poise to plan better and to give more clarity to the market around what it's procuring and the timelines. I just think it's all been a bit too breathless.
I need just to remind to keep the questions succinct and answer to the question because we are really tight with time. Before we are moving to the next part within our procurement review, just a comment, and I really welcome it that you are going back to the Chamber of Commerce. It's important that you also address Institute of Directors and Construction Council because all three organizations submitted their evidence to the panel. And the sentiment, it's exactly the same sentiment. It's not just the Chamber of Commerce saying about the system, it's also Institute of Directors and Construction Council. So this feedback came across all three big organizations. And I think something like you mentioned, you used the word noise, but I think that for me it's concerns from the small businesses. And I would like to remind everyone that Jersey is a lot of small business economy, and this is why it's important that the concerns from the small businesses will be heard and will be addressed as well. David, you wanted to ask?
Yeah, just as the owner of a small business and who's recently experienced, I mean, I recognise completely that commentary from the Chamber of Commerce for our organisation. The thing which, I mean, I think we took something like a week to try and get a list of our products listed with on the government's site, backwards and forwards. What's subsequently been apparent, it seems to me, is a lack of training almost on the people who are procuring from us. So for me, it's rather than going through a system, someone will pick up a phone. This is from the government side to us in terms of placing orders. They don't seem to be particularly familiar with how exactly to use a procurement system from their point of view, because obviously it's really important that they stick to the rules because otherwise we don't get paid as an organisation. So one of the observations I would say from as a business who uses the government services is training for me is very apparent that there is not a familiarity with the system that would be really helpful.
Yeah, it's a great point. That's what I meant in terms of trying to do what we've been doing in planning recently and going in with a team and really having a concerted sprint piece of work with that team to work on capability. It is a bit stretched, obviously, that team when the numbers we've got in terms of the number of suppliers, but I recognise that. I think there's just two other things that's important if we're moving away from procurement to say, which I think is very important context for this table and for the chamber when I get to see them. The first thing is most of these systems were put in to give the government better oversight and control of its own money after a period in which it was believed the government didn't have good oversight and control of its own money because it was very siloed and departmentalism and suppliers everywhere, and it was deemed to be a bit chaotic. So the spirit of a lot of the changes that have happened in recent years have been to put these systems in to try and get government oversight, clarity and governance. They weren't put in to address necessarily the needs of those who were interacting with them in the first instance. And related to that, it's a very important point. When you put in these systems, or were thinking of putting in these systems, I was one of the people who was consulted by someone in the then CEO's office, because my organisation had just put in Workday. You've got three choices really in the modern world. You've got, if you're a big organisation, you've probably got SAP, Oracle and Workday. We put in Workday. The team came to see me to understand the pros and cons of Workday and the user experience, presumably while they were trying to work out whether to choose that or SAP or one of the other ones. Either way, they chose SAP. When you put these enterprise resource planning systems in, even if you commit to all the money, which we haven't, even if you did, in my experience, it takes a number of years before you reach a settled state, particularly when the system that replaces it had been there for 25 years. So all your colleagues have to get used to the changes. All your external parties have to get used to the changes. You have to yourself work out how to make the system, which is largely out the box, work best in your context. And I know that Jersey's not famed for patience, but this actually takes a number of years before you reach an optimal state. We are currently operationally halfway through year 2.
Okay.
So this is the foothills of this. And even though we're halfway through year 2, as you can see from the top 100 list and from the numbers I've given you, Jersey business is doing very well out of the government of Jersey in terms of the money that we're putting directly into that economy, this economy.
But it does going back to the big businesses, and it was mentioned about the white list and who is getting the contracts and the small local businesses. But we will continue this and we'll look into this. No, we need to move to SAP. As you mentioned, SAP system that was implemented, I'll hand to the Deputy Moore to continue the questions around the SAP implementation.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, this is a long process and one of your biggest procurement projects. So could you just remind us how many modules were committed to in the full business case?
Oh, I'd need to write you with that detail.
Okay.
All I can tell you for sure is it's less than was in the original business case, because the subsequent budgets, there's been de-scoping. The maintenance budgets, to my mind, are lower than they would need to be for a SAP system, but it's less, but I just don't have those numbers, unless you have them, Seba.
To the best of my knowledge.
I can write you with them.
If you could, so we'd like to be reminded how many modules were committed to in the full business case versus how many are now being implemented and the reasons for that change. That would be very helpful. So as the system is rolled out, could you describe to us, please, how you're tracking the benefits of introducing the new system?
So this isn't about the procurement of the system, this is about its implementation.
Yes, but when undertaking procurement, one expects that there's an expectation that it will improve the working of the organisation that it's there to serve, and how that interacts.
Well, first of all, on its procurement, I have gone back and looked back, as I said, and I go to my previous remarks. It's better to move in with people rather than judge them 4 years after the fact. In procuring this system, you used a specialist broker, TIC, who understood it. You had quite a wide consultation, including with me in my old job. You ended up looking in detail, it looks like, at the 3 market leaders. You did something which I think is inspired and is still serving us well. You insisted on quite a programme of social value with implementation of SAP. You insisted on a non-island specialist support service from a non-island contractor who's still supporting us to this day. You insisted on non-island training of the local IT industry through PwC, which is still with us to this day. So in terms of what you bought, the act of procurement and how you bought it, with the benefit of hindsight looking back, it's pretty much what I'd have expected you to do. On its implementation, it's actually quite difficult to track as well as one would like, because there's been elements of de-scoping. The budgets seem to have changed once we got into it. There's been de-scoping. As I said, I'm concerned that the maintenance budget for SAP, this is a general concern about Government of Jersey, to your request for observations, that you've bought SAP, you largely bought it out the box, you didn't customise it, thank goodness. But your budget for maintenance, which can include upgrades pushed on you, which are mandatory, it can include modules which you see would really make a difference to your business and you want to pull down. That whole ecosystem, you buy the ecosystem with something like SAP, we've got an ongoing budget of £2.5 million for that. That's way lower than I would have expected it to be for a system of that nature, which is going enterprise-wide. So I need to, where we have a consistent business case that hasn't been de-scoped or for one reason or another, and I think probably the best example of that is going to be in Treasury, we do have the tracking of the benefits against that and the expectations of it. I think the same will be substantially true in people services, although again, I believe there might have been some de-scoping in aspects of that. There are many other areas where SAP is, where we've changed business cases and where it won't be rolled out as anticipated. So it's quite a messy environment, but I'll do my best when I write back to you to try and get to the bottom of that. But I would just ask everyone to remember that you bought it for a particular reason. I know people aren't necessarily all supporting that reason at the moment, but it does take a number of years to get the best out of a system like SAP, and you definitely have to invest on it in the way through, because you join an ecosystem and you have to pull the benefits from that ecosystem with money.
So you've mentioned training as a part of the programme and the contract with the delivery agent partner, which was Keytree and also PwC. Training is a point that is consistently raised as somewhere, an area where there is a need for greater work. So how is this being delivered through the delivery partners, and how effective has this been?
Again, I would like the budget to be bigger. They're not going to be bigger. I'm just saying I would like them to be bigger for the avoidance of doubt. I think, I'm not sure in these hearings, am I naming individual contractors or what's the...
No, it's in the public domain
So obviously in the case of Weir and PwC, that is ongoing. I think the next thing that the next leg of that is the connection into Highlands College and ramping that up so that the training's not just of the existing industry and existing suppliers, that it goes down into vocational education is the next place we're going with that. But it's a very important point. We really need to follow through in that investment, because this system will probably be with us for as long as the last system, which is a generation, and we're going to get the most benefit out of it if we upskill our own ecosystem of engineers and suppliers. So I think that the team would say that in terms of the original business case, they're fulfilling that. Probably what we found as we've got into it, that we've got a need for even more training, which again is not a surprise, but it's evident we've got a need for more. So we're having those discussions again with our partners, soon with Highlands, if it's not started already, around what more we can do in this area. It's a priority for us.
Yeah, well, as you've mentioned, it wasn't a surprise, because it was known at the time of procurement that there was a lack of expertise, particularly with regard to maintenance in the island for this particular system. So,
oh well, you've got an advantage over me there. I wasn't involved at that stage, but in the case of SAP, obviously my old organisation didn't choose it. And we found there was a shortage of engineers for that system as well in the island. I think the island and shortage of engineers go together in many contexts. But certainly there's one or two large organisations in the island that use SAP, including a very major international bank. So it's not that it's a completely alien system to this environment. But if your question is there a shortage of SAP engineers around this jurisdiction and other jurisdictions at the moment? The answer to that is yes.
We'll follow up with written questions because we'd like to get some numbers. First of all, models implemented, not implemented, how much was spent per each contractor to implement the system, how much ongoing maintenance. I think that some numbers around this would help PAC to consider. And we will go to the last part around the procurement, and Director Wilson would ask question around the consultants.
Okay, thank you. Are you able to clarify how the government defines consultants in the context of procurement and spending? And are there different types or categories of consultants? And if so, are they counted and reported separately in terms of expenditure and impact?
Jeepers, well, we have definitions of consultants, which I can read out. I suspect that's what you don't want, or I can write to you with the definition.
I'm more interested in if you can give us your view and whether you can clarify what the definition of consultant is.
Sure. I mean, in my view, it's where you take advice, strategic or otherwise, from outside your organisation and outside the business as usual environment. It's where you procure skills and expertise that you deem are not available to you inside your organisation. It's access to data and information not available to your organisation where you want to join in with other organisations. It's time limited engagements, a specific piece of work in again, and it's where you define ideally specific deliverables in a timeline and you work to that. So that's how I would think about it in layman's terms. I think of course, the great skill of consultants is that they are amorphous, they're mercurial, and they do their best when they get into an organisation to make themselves indispensable. They shoot for longevity, they shoot for mission scope, so you have to manage them quite tightly. And of course, there's very big UK reviews of big four consultancy companies for this very point of them creeping from audit into consultancy and back again, and it all been terribly complicated. So that's the way I think about them, and they have to be watched very carefully and procured very carefully if you're going to get value and avoid a situation where you potentially find yourself in almost a recurring retainer relationship, which becomes business as usual.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So do you accept that there are different types of consultants in the public sector?
In public service, yeah, of course, in any organisation.
And how might they be different and categorised?
Well, we have very specific technical consultancy for very defined pieces of work. We wouldn't keep a whole team on hand to reclad the tunnel, for example. We'd probably procure something like that. You have management consultancy where you want help with an aspect of your strategy. You can have technical accounting consultancy if you feel that you've got a specific issue in your P&L and balance sheet that meets it. So there's a whole category of them. I prefer to think about them in purchase order terms. At the end of the day, I've got to raise a purchase order for a service, and does that purchase order category capture what I regard as consultancy? And that's the way I tend to think about it when I'm running an organisation.
Okay, thank you. The consultants reporting on their use by Government of Jersey law, which is P59 2019, requires the Chief Minister to present a report to the States on a 6-monthly basis on the use of consultants by the Government of Jersey. Can you tell us what steps you've taken in order to improve the overall reporting on the use of consultants in the States Assembly, to the States Assembly?
I haven't taken any specific steps vis-a-vis the State Assembly. Most of the steps I've taken have been to make sure that I, as a Chief Executive Officer, can get comfortable with what's been procured, why it's been procured and how much it's costing. So I've been focused much more on prioritisation, control and oversight, and trying to align the work of the consultants in government with the priorities of government.
And what guidance,
which I think will help us all. In terms of the reporting and oversight, I know that the regular reporting was in part disrupted by some of those changes in the team that I alluded to last year, which the Treasurer's working through. They were certainly impacted by systems changed over SAP and other things. But I'd imagine that report to the Assembly is imminent.
Okay, thank you. Could you also explain what guidance you've specifically given to departments on how to assess and determine the work of consultants? And how does this relate to the outcomes that they're trying to achieve?
So I've done a number of, obviously they already had a number of obligations under the public finance law and so forth, but specifically what I have done is introduced, I think, set a general expectation that we have to be much more careful in our use of consultants. One of the things I think you all know that I did was recommend to ministers in the last government and this, that they pare back their capital programme budget to what was a more realistic level for, in terms of what they could consume.
Just a minute, because we're at the time, the question is, what's the guidance, sorry that I'm interrupting, what's the guidance we're given to the departments about freeze of consultants?
Sure.
Because it was very clear, we're freezing on consultants, and we received different feedback from the public. What's freeze and what not freeze department receive as a clear guidance from you?
So it was freezing on recruitment, not freezing on consultants. On consultants, it's been much more about greater oversight, control around the use of consultancy spend. So in the narrow, to answer your question, what we've done is, in addition to the controls that were already there, we now have a system which is online and live. If you wish to procure any new consultancy arrangement, you have a decision tree about whether it's highly technical, in which case you don't need the approval of the chief executive. You can get the approval at your chief officer level. It's very specialist. If it doesn't meet those criteria of highly technical, and therefore is in that broader category of consultancy, it needs to be signed off by me.
Okay.
Digitally signed off by me.
Okay, thank
So
you.
that's the
everything
only
can
new,
go to yourselves, for example,
that's the only new control in addition to the controls that would already been there in government.
So just to get it right, if there is a consultant that work in the capacity, because we don't have expertise on the island, I'll not mention the area, but it was reported to us, and the member of the public was told we cannot, it's a freeze, we cannot engage with consultants because we cannot renew the contract. Would this particular person would have an appeal, and was that appeal to get to yourself to ask, actually, we don't have this expertise, it's essential skills to support individuals on the island in specific areas. Would it come to you, or they just got blank no from the department?
Is this, are you talking about a colleague who's told a member of the public that they can't?
No, member of the public approached me personally.
Oh, they've not had their consultancy contract renewed?
There is member of the public that received services from a consultant from outside of the island, because we don't have expertise on the island. And they stopped receiving the services because the contract for the consultant hasn't been reviewed.
So there can be a number of things there. Bear in mind, we've reduced the capital budget by about 40
No,
million.
my question is simple.
But this is important. It's not just the system that could have led to that. We've cut growth bids by 20%. We've reduced the capital budget. We've put freezes in. The department might have looked at their budget and thought that service isn't essential anymore and withdrawn it. Therefore, that's what the public could be referring to. It might not be that we stopped the consultant because of our consultancy policy. We probably stopped that consultancy service because of the budget. That's a different thing.
No, when you have essential services that connected to health and education, it's something that connected to actual well-being of the people, that sometimes we don't have all expertise in health and education and social care.
That's a chief officer decision about what they
Now,
want to do.
can the member of the public appeal and to go to yourself?
To ask me what?
I mean, how the member of the public that feel that the service that been stopped is essential service, because basically if I'm going back, it was not one case, it was 2 or 3 cases that brought to the attention, and all of them from different areas, but areas that connected to health, mental health, and general well-being, because general conditions. the expertise that we required from out of the island is not available on the island. And people were told we cannot continue engage with the consultants because there is a freeze on the consultants. This is the words that were used. My question, not about particular cases, when we hear about these cases, what's the process to appeal?
So I think it's difficult without knowing the example, but I think if a chief officer or a member of their team decide to withdraw a service, and they could have multiple reasons for withdrawing a service, in running the service, they're a leader, that's their prerogative. They have to be accountable for withdrawing that service, and they have to explain it well to whoever the clients are on the end of that service. It doesn't follow that the service has been withdrawn because of the policy we've got in not hiring consultants. They might have withdrawn it for a range of reasons, but there is no appeal process to me. If we decided not to renew a consultancy contract, we decided not to renew a consultancy contract, it would be up to those providing the service to either provide it in a different way or to continue with the service. That wouldn't.
Shall we
Can
move
I-
on to complaints?
Yeah, we need
There's
to.
just
Yeah,
one question
they
about-
would go on the website and put a complaint in that they weren't getting the service, and we would
Yeah.
follow up through the complaints process.
Yeah,
Thank
one
you.
more question.
I just want to touch on the issue of resilience, and the PAC noted that the response to recommendation 4 of the use of consultants report was accepted, but it is limited in scope. Can you tell us what steps are being taken to ensure the actions outlined in the strategic workforce planning, skills and succession strategy are being achieved, and how you're monitoring that? Bearing in mind having that operational and organisational resilience behind the drivers for some of these strategic intentions.
Let me just familiarise myself with that particular recommendation, sorry. Oh, right, yeah. I think that's, in my view, that's superseded by what we put in place this year around consultants. So there was a very clear view when we went through our common workshops and discussed the goals and what we'd want to happen. There's a very clear view from the current COM that wherever possible, we'd like to see a reduction in the consultancy spend and the use of consultants within the organisation. One of the primary drivers of that was a concern that actually it wasn't the right thing for the workforce in many cases in terms of not upskilling and developing the capability of the workforce. So we put in the controls I was just talking about there and the new system of control for the use of consultants. So I regard that as to some extent substantially superseded.
Where is that monitored?
Where's what monitored?
Where is that activity monitored in terms
Oh,
of the
that
processes
activity monitor,
that you've put in place?
we obviously we're only 6 weeks, not obviously, but we only introduced it on the 1st of August, so we're 6 weeks into it. So it's built on one of our platforms. We get monthly MI on it, and we'll look at it after 3 months, because almost certainly we'll have to make adjustments in terms of, to the chair's point, we might not have got the categorisation between technical and non-technical, right, and so forth. So it'll be subject to 3-month review in terms of whether we have to change anything, but I now see that data monthly. I can see it weekly if I want, but it doesn't make much sense weekly, so it's very tightly controlled.
Thank you.
Okay, as you know, Chief Executive, we are conducting a review into the handling and learning from complaints. Could you just describe to us briefly what you think about the current handling and learning from complaints process and how government is performing in this area?
Yeah, I mean, what to say about this? Again, this is something I've looked after complaints in another place earlier in my career, so some familiarisation with it. I think in terms of the system that I've come into, in terms of policy, the policy we've got, in terms of the system we're using to deal with complaints, and in terms of responsiveness, I'd say in the first two, it's what I expected. There's nothing in the policy you can look at and think that it's out of whack with other organisations. In terms of the system, of course, everyone would like the very latest piece of software kit and complaints with closed loop feedback and all the rest of it built into it, but what's being built within the organisation for the organisation, which is a system for colleagues to use in resolving and responding to complaints. It's not a system for the public to use, it's a system for colleagues to use. I think it's good enough for us to have a decent service and to make continual improvements in the service. We have improvements planned for it, and for that system, but I don't think I could use the policy or the system as any kind of reason not to have a decent level of performance in terms of complaint handling and how we address this issue. So I'm happy enough with those in terms of what I've inherited. Probably where we have work to do is across the board. There are pockets of good practice, but across the board on how we use that system and those policies to be as responsive as we possibly can be, and to be as good as we can be at resolving things quickly if we can't obviously resolve them at the first point of contact. So pleased in the first two, what to do in the third.
Thank you. I think Deputy Ward was to ask the next question, which is 28.
28, sorry, I didn't realise I was in on that one. Okay, sorry, cut me short here. So the PAC noted that government rejected recommendation 3 from the handling and learning from complaints follow-up, which was to develop an overarching, coherent, prioritised and resourced action plan to deliver on the stated duty to ensure all customers can easily provide feedback on publicly funded services. In its response, the committee stated, whilst this is noted by the PAC, it has not seen evidence of these methods in practice through the response to the recommendation. Furthermore, it is not clear to the reader of this response how these processes are undertaken to ensure they are being tracked and monitored effectively. Please advise PAC on what these processes are and how they are being tracked and monitored effectively.
Yeah,
That's a very long question,
I think if we're talking about the same ones, I don't think colleagues accepted that recommendation, did they? I think they rejected that recommendation. They rejected that recommendation because they thought it was a description of BAU in the large, and that what else would they be doing from one day to the next other than what is described there. They are engaged in a process of continuous improvement. They are engaged in a process of trying to figure out what enhancements they can make to the systems, how they can be better with customers. So I think they felt that recommendation would not cause them to make any material change in strategy or approach. It would not cause any material change in resources available to them. So therefore, as a set of actions, it wasn't delineated enough from BAU, so it was rejected.
How do you get a sense of across the piece that complaints are being properly dealt with for the benefit of a sort of holistic approach?
Yeah,
including all departments, health, education, SIPes.
It's a great approach, a great question. I think we obviously have a specialist team who are based in one department, and CLS are responsible for enterprise-wide. Our functional leaders on this. We get monthly data from them, obviously, on what's happening. We hardwire that into the ELT's objectives. They've got very specific objectives around their complaints performance and complaints resolution performance, and they're held to account quarterly through that objective. We have in our quarterly sort of operating rhythm in our operating rhythm for the executive leadership team, we will have a deep dive update with the complaints and customer experience team every quarter. That will happen in the same agenda as we look at risk, so that we can actually look at the read across between the two. So we get a report, basically this report, which gives us detail in every area, all the staff should expect, and their recommendations for where we need to do something. And to give you an example of that in action, that's why at the start of this year we decided that, the two biggest complaints that we get into government are financial regulation, which isn't directly our bailiwick, and planning. So based on the information received from this team and from what we could see across our systems, that's why we decided to have a deep dive in planning and regulation, send in the specialist team with that team for 2 6-week sprints to try and raise our level of performance. So hopefully that gives you a feeling of how the executive team get the information and then decide to do something
And that
about
would
it.
include health, education.
Education is, in fact, going back to the last government, there was a real concern about getting education in schools in particular onto the system, and they're now on the system. I'm delighted to say that's now up and running, that's in training mode. I think in the case of health, we're not there yet. Obviously within health there are other systems. It's a complicated environment, obviously the clinical environment. So we're there on schools, we're not there in health. That's not to say that they don't do anything and that the health board and others don't see the information. But for the rest of the organisation, yeah, we're aiming for that consistent approach. And we're, you know, one of the things that maybe wasn't happening enough is having that customer experience team at the top table, presenting quarterly their concerns and where they felt we had to take action, and that's what's now happening. It's pretty much alongside the risk discussion, which I'm sure we'll talk about later.
Okay, thank you.
I'll have to let you see one of those reports if it helps you to see what we see, if you see what I mean.
Yes, please.
No, but we will continue really to look into the handling complaints and feedback. And it's interesting that you mentioned, we know that, and thank you for recognizing it and being completely open, that we need to do more work around health and SIBs for handling complaints. If we are looking into the health and SIBs, their budget is more than half of overall budget of the organization, if we are thinking about, and the number of people that they're touching, the families and engagement day to day, it's probably one of the highest from other department. Obviously CLS, they have lots of engagement, but health and SIBs, that are the biggest department. So why, I think that the focus that we'll continue to explore together as we are going through the review, what will be done in that area. I'm moving to the recommendation tracker. As a chief executive, what is your assessment of the current, I would say, state of nation in regard to your key themes to be addressed within the recommendation tracker?
Well, first of all, to say that it's one of many useful inputs to trying to figure out where to prioritise as you run the organisation. So I find it's obviously not the only input, but it's a very useful input, particularly if you're sat right at the top, like me. So it is very important to us. That's why we've put how the executive team interact with and follow up in the tractor directly into their quarterly objectives alongside complaints to recognise the importance of it. In terms of thematics, I wouldn't pick out a theme necessarily in terms of a recurring theme across the many actions, but definitely we have a situation, or definitely there's a situation where I'm not sure that we had a mature risk rating of actions on the tracker previously, and I think one of the read across from our work on risk management and strategic risk management in the risk register is actually making sure that we're properly having a risk rated approach to what's on the tracker. So in terms of proper risk assessments on recommendations from the CNAG and our executive responses, that's something I'm keen that is an area that we improve, and then that we're consistent in how we think about that and our risk registers. For example, if you decide as a senior officer to reject a recommendation or to delay taking action on it for a material period of time, we want to be sure that you're not running an operational risk that you shouldn't be, or that if you do want to run that operational risk, it's properly assessed, and if needs be, it's reflected in the risk register. So I'd say from coming into it fresh, that's one of the main things that I'm looking at as a theme. The other thing I'm looking at, which is consistent with the answer I gave you at the top, is one thing to have these things, but let's look at, can it be prioritised? Have you got the cash? Have you got the systems resource? Have you got the people? if it requires a change in the law, have you got access to that resource and legislative time to do it? So really be thoughtful in accepting an action that you're going to put yourself in a position where you can follow through and do it. So my focus is much more about the team taking full ownership of the feedback they're getting from the CNAG in that way. I'm not suggesting that previously they were sticking things on there and not paying enough attention to them, but for the avoidance of doubt, I want them to be really thoughtful in accepting a recommendation that they actually have the resources, the plans and the appetite to follow it through.
I completely agree, because it's important that we have resources and prioritization. You mentioned also the risk. And it is one of the recommendations, or couple of the recommendations that were done 2 years ago. It's around long-term care. We all know that long-term care funded through the benefit system paid by CLS, with HCS paying the cost above the top-up level. So it's across 2 departments. Recently, actually not recently, in Q1 this year, you closed the recommendation 15, which saying that we need to review and update existing framework and agreements with all care providers. Again, you are in the process. It still hasn't been finished, but a recommendation has been closed. So it's not clear what action was taken in the response and where we are generally with the long-term healthcare providers and what we do have on the island, because it was several reports done in 2022.
Is this one that we wrote to you about separately, where we had a colleague error where it had been closed and they hadn't notified it properly? Remind me, Seb.
Yeah, that's correct. It was one of the questions that came from your committee officer in advance, that when we went back and looked at the tracker, there was no update, which, you know, can quite understand why the PAC were wanted to know more about that. They put something into the tracker in the wrong field. It was a colleague error. We can get you a proper update.
But is this recommendation closed or open, and all other recommendations around the long-term care providers?
I think at the moment, in terms of an approved provider framework, if that's what you're asking to, it's drafted, but I think that the team feel that a domiciliary care market review needs to be finalised before that new framework can be agreed and implemented with providers. So that's where it's at the moment.
Why we have this conversation, how we prioritize recommendation and what are the risks? If I'm looking back at the recommendation was done by CNAG in February 2022 and by Care Commission, I think it was in November 2022. We're talking about 2 years ago, which very clear stated that the long-term care is not supported by an overarching commissioning model. Individual health and social care professionals take responsibility for sourcing residential and other care. I'm really trying to keep it short. Whilst many individuals are free to make their own choice of a residential care setting, in reality, the choice is limited and market is stretched. So back 2 years ago, we've been told we don't have enough care provision. We don't have somebody who is coordinating this and making future-proof. And we've been told we need to create a new framework.
By the CNAG.
By CNAG and also Care Commissioner, I can find actually the report. So basically, 2 years ago, we've been told we do have a problem. We need to start to create a system that will meet the demand. And today we know that we have again 32 people in the hospital because they don't have care provision in the community. How this risk has been identified, because if these recommendations will be acted in timely fashion, we might not be facing 32 people in the hospital today.
Yeah, well, I mean, all I can tell you is that the relevant department are where they are. Is it tier 1 risk in the community risk register?
It's a very good question, because it's between two departments and how these two departments work. And
I'll check for you.
the outcome is very clear today in the public domain, but when we are looking back about recommendation that was closed, not sure where it is, we're trying to make. And by the way, I really welcome our work. I need to say that the work that we had with SAP and with yourself, and we started to look into the recommendation and try to implement risk approach, and I completely understand it will take time. And it's something that we will work together, and I'm welcoming this work. I'm just raising this point that we will continue to challenge how the risks assess and how recommendations would be implemented in the.
With that one, to answer your question, the important thing for me is I don't think it will be a tier 1 risk in the community risk register, but I'll check. It's therefore a risk within the portfolio of that chief officer and by extension, that minister. I know it's an area that they do focus on and think about a lot, because you're right to say that we are concerned that one should only spend as much time as hospital as one actually needs. The longer you spend in there when you don't need treatment, all the research shows that's not a good outcome for anyone in the system, not least the patient. So I know it's an important issue for them, and it will be featuring in the work they're doing as they contemplate their whole health system and make sure that the money that's available within that system moves around that system in a way that optimises things for the patient. Obviously, this government's been around since January, February. This issue's been around for longer, so I think it must be one that's under consideration, but it won't have been risk categorised at such a level that it will move up for immediate action. I'll double check that in writing, but I would imagine that's the case and that's how it's been assessed by.
But immediate action was it's about how we're moving 2 years past, and within 2 years the action could be taken. It's not immediate action. It's action that could be done.
It could have been done last year.
Or 2 years ago when it was done, so put in
So
place.
that means that
Absolutely.
A number of ministers now have, for whatever reason, not prioritised it to the point where it's gotten done.
But it's chief officers who are delivering these recommendations from CNAG as well. So we are moving towards the risks. Actually, it's really good transition to the risks.
You've talked about prioritisation a lot. How would you assess the risk appetite across the states generally?
That's a great question. The organisation is competent in the whole issue of risk registers. There's a process for identifying risk, for horizon scanning, for gateways to get them onto the risk register, for getting onto the top register. So the sort of enterprise-wide risk management approach you'd expect to see in a big organisation is there. The bit of the organisation that's less mature, in my view and experience, it might not be shared by all colleagues, is in risk appetite. So we don't really have a good faculty at the moment, I think, for discussing and expressing our risk appetite and then seeing that risk appetite reflected not just in the risk, the management programme, but also in the budget and in the plan of the government of the day. So this is something that we discussed with the chair of the Risk and Audit Committee when we had our last quarterly risk update. She came along and presented from their perspective as well to ELT. So this is something that we're working up to actually to take to ministers, that we do feel that the work around arriving at risk appetite and expressing it in tangible terms is less mature than the risk register work, the risk identification work.
Because when I looked at the state's accounts last year, there's actually quite a good summary of the high-level risks, where there's extreme risk around well-being, and also quite a good summary of the other risks that are being looked at. But could you describe how you use risk? How do you assess risk in terms of prioritisation, given the immaturity of the system?
Certainly, immaturity of the expression of risk appetite. I think within the system we get good data in compiling the CSB. We would cross-check that with the big risks. We'd cross-check it with the big risks in the community register to make sure that the programme of the government of the day wasn't aligned to a risk that really had to be dealt with in the next 18 months. For example, we use that risk register in prioritising the budget reductions in capital spend. So when we looked at capital spend and tried to take that number from what we thought was an unrealistic number for all sorts of reasons to a more credible number, one of the drivers of that was to ring fence tier 1 risk from the community register. In other words, if it was judged a high risk on that register, it had to be prioritised in the capital programme. It couldn't be de-scoped. So we use it to inform. We use the risk register to inform budget decisions, spending decisions. We use it to inform delivery in departmental and ministerial portfolios. So it is the register and what it tells us about our risk and organisation is a live document which informs our decision making. The bit that's missing is the risk appetite, or the bit that's not as well defined as the risk appetite. And I think that's one of the points that the FPP made yesterday as well.
You use the expression a couple of tier 1 risks. What is a tier 1 risk? I should know.
Tier 1 risks, that's just our term for those biggest risks on our community risk register, those biggest risks to the island and to its sustainability. And those are looked at, that register's looked at in the Emergency Plannings Council, it's looked at in the officer group which tracks the Emergency Planning Council. So that's where we're looking at the big things that could knock us off course or that we would find difficult to deal with should they arise.
And the
day-to-day risks you've seen in our risk strategies being published, how we assess risks day-to-day, that's a published document.
how often does your leadership team review risk?
We do it
progress on
exact same framework as complaints, deep dive quarterly.
Yeah.
We also, although it's not form of risk management, in our other quarters, the CNAG will come along in one of those quarters, the chair of the Risk and Audit Committee will come along those quarters. So in every meeting we keep it at the forefront of our attention, but quarterly we'll dive into it. And I think that's sensible because you've probably got something wrong in your risk register if it changes every week. It shouldn't, that would suggest that you hadn't done the exercise properly. So that's how we do it. And we also, of course, look at the community risk register in the Emergency Plannings Council and all the supporting groups for that.
There's just a question of detail here arising out of the resilience, of the critical infrastructure resilience report that was done by the CNAG, where it was talking about the need for emergency planning arrangements at La Colette and the fact that that was urgent, but it seems to be taking 18 months to address an urgent issue. And I'm wondering why it would take 18 months to prepare an emergency planning plan for La Colette, given the critical nature of that facility to the island.
Yeah, I'm not sure in the detail of that, where we are with it, but I'll have to write back to the committee. Have we got detail on
No, not specifically why.
La Colette? So, but yeah, I'm happy to come back to you on that.
Thank you. So it's now back to
Yeah,
the chair.
just one comment. You mentioned the biggest concern is the risk appetite. So what actual steps can you take to improve that, and how will you know when you've got your organisation in place where you're comfortable with it?
And the expression of risk appetite, not the biggest concern, but I felt it was less mature than all the work that
Well,
we've done to identify the
you
risk
raise
registers.
that as
It can be done in a number of ways, quite often with strategic risk appetite, which is what we're talking about. Quite often it will be done through discourse, both at an executive level and at Council of Ministers level. So I'd expect us to assimilate the strategic information we've got from the risk registers, the strategic information we've got yesterday, for example, from the report that was published by the FPP, and we really want to have more considered debates about our understanding of what risks we're running and what our appetite is for that risk. So to give you a live example, yeah, we've got an FPP, got that right, haven't I? Yeah, we've got an FPP report essentially saying to us, look, your strategic reserve should be about 5 times the size it is. Why are they saying the strategic reserve should be 5 times the size it is? They're saying that because we've got a very successful offshore financial centre which pays for half of government every year in terms of direct taxation, probably way more in indirect taxation, multipliers. That's variable income. That income is now potentially more vulnerable post Pillar 2. It's potentially vulnerable to a number of factors. That's variable income. But against it, you've got rising health costs, rising social security costs. The two things almost identically match on the P&L and the balance sheet at the moment. And they're really saying to us, if something happens to that money from that offshore financial centre, you could very quickly have a big income gearing problem in your business model. You could be in trouble. Now, when you have that kind of risk, you do everything you can to make sure that doesn't happen, and the Minister's announced a competitive review and things. But really what they're saying is, you're going to give everyone outside of Jersey more confidence if you've got 6 years' money on the sideboard. So that if it does happen, you can say, no, let's just settle our way down. We can finance the transition out of this. We've got time to reorganise our expenditure if we have to. That's a big strategic risk they've identified on the balance sheet and P&L of this island. And that's where I think we have to take that now and have a really good strategic discussion about it and decide whether that means we want to change our actions today, our policies today, and reflect that. And it's probably one for the next government, to be fair. Do they want to reflect that in a future budget? Do they want to take actions to, have they got a risk appetite for that risk? And if they don't like that risk, if the risk appetite is actually, based on that advice, that's too big of a risk, then we have to take actions in the business plan to fix it.
So the issue that you're raising with risk appetite, is it identification or is it following up and implementation? Why did you raise this concern about risk appetite? I'm trying to understand better what the problem is.
Risk identification is one thing, sizing it and working out what it is. Deciding whether you're prepared to live with it, what the risks of living with it are, is another one. And if you're not prepared to live with it at the level you've identified it at, you need to express a different appetite.
How will you know that this is in place in the organisation so you, next time around, you come back and you say, I'm comfortable with how we're dealing with this?
Oh, well, look, this is a strategic issue, and all organisations are the same thing between execs and boards and other places. I'm not saying everyone's going to agree in the risk appetite, but if we get to the point where we've got an implicit risk appetite to have a much smaller reserve, relative to the size of our economy, we need to then show in the risk register the risks of running with that appetite. I just want the two things to match up.
So you're looking for a better balance?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand what you said.
Angry, a more explicit recognition.
Yes.
A more explicit recognition that you are running that risk.
What the risk and how it's being dealt with and make it explicit and visible. Thank you.
Exactly.
Okay.
As you indicated that you have extra 10 minutes, we are moving to the last small session. It's mainly around your
So this
position.
is around CEO recruitment, you'll be pleased to hear. It was stated by the Chief Minister in the States Assembly on the 25th of June that you are on a contract for 6 months with an option to extend for a further 2 years, should both parties agree. Are you able to advise the PAC on the nature and extent of your current contract?
Well, I believe it's been published, has it?
Contract wouldn't be
It's been
published.
published.
No.
There's not much more to it than what you've described.
Right.
It is a contract for 6 months with an option to extend at the salary, which I think has been disclosed, and on the terms, which I think have been disclosed. So there's not much more to add.
Okay.
That's 3 months away.
Where are we now? Almost.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
given that situation, and you may not have decided what it is that you wanted to do, is there in the background a support plan just in case you decide it's not going to be, you don't want to extend it?
Oh, no, I mean, that's much more a matter for the chairman of the SEB, I would say, rather than me. I mean, I don't award myself contracts.
But it does deal with the effectiveness of the way the organisation's run.
There's definitely an understanding that we'll have a discussion at the end of the quarter, which is coming up now, about the extension.
Okay.
And I would imagine that the chairman of the SEB, the chief people officer and others have thought about all eventualities.
Okay.
Thanks. So based on your current contract, do you feel you're able to implement the strategic vision you have for the civil service?
Well, I think when you're on a 6-month contract, I think it would take a healthy dose of self-conceit to have a strategic vision for the civil service.
Loaded question.
I think I would observe that the Government of Jersey already has a strategic vision and set of values that it spent a fair bit of money developing a number of years ago. So those are still in existence. My approach is to work with the best of what's around me. But obviously, given my timescales, and frankly, given the timescales for the government, there's an element of this which is much more pragmatic and trying to focus on getting things done in accordance with the priorities that have been expressed by the elected members.
Thank you. Okay, so what specific advice and thoughts can you advise the PAC on how you feel that the CEO role should be developed or revised going forward?
Oh, jeepers, I haven't really given that much thought there. I'm afraid I don't have any big thoughts on it at the moment. I'm too busy doing the job to think about how the job could or should be different. The only thing I would say is I know there's been much debate on this in the past, but you know, whatever job you've got, whatever it says in the job description, you've got a job to do. You have to get stuff done. So a lot of my focus has been trying to get this very large and multifaceted organisation to gather around a smaller set of priorities and frankly try and get some stuff done. I think there's a real risk to the reputation of government in Jersey that becomes famous for what it doesn't do. It needs to start becoming famous for saying, I'm going to do something and I've done it. And trying to get the organisation into that operating rhythm of thinking, yeah, let's do that. People might not agree with the things that have been chosen to be done, but let's at least start to get a track record of doing things in the meantime. So it's very much that pragmatic approach I've taken because of the context I've come into.
Okay, so I'm conscious time's running out. Last question then. So can you advise the PAC on what is currently the plan in relation to the recruitment of a permanent CEO?
No, I can't. I don't have any. I'm not including any discussions like that at SEB or elsewhere.
Okay,
Another question, did you start a process for recruitment for the permanent chief officer for customer and local service for CLS?
I don't know for sure that, but obviously we made an interim appointment when the incumbent stood down, but I'm not sure if they've started the process yet. I need to come back to you on that, but we're very happy with the interim arrangements. We don't feel at risk at the moment, and I think the interim's only been in office for, is it 3 weeks or 4 weeks, something like that. But I'm sure they'll follow their normal processes in due course.
But the question is, if I'm looking now at your executive leadership team, we have interim chief officer for customer and local services. Now we have interim chief officer for health and community services. You are recruiting now interim for the position for the cabinet office. Yourself, we don't know if you would continue. We hope you would for some stability beyond December, and it's 6 months every time. 6 months to consider would you continue, you would not continue. How can you reassure public that we do have stability within the civil service, because the top civil service we have now 4 positions, including yourself, it's interim?
Yeah, I'm happy to give that reassurance. I mean, one of the things that's a great credit to my colleagues, no credit to me at all, is there are very strong succession plans in place for the government. We've got a clear idea of who might be able to do what job, and when situations like this arise, we've obviously got situations in each department where we have someone that we know would step in if someone took ill or if they left suddenly, and we're trying to invest in our leadership cadre below the ELT. So in risk register terms, I'm not concerned about the risk to the organisation or the public service from the interim appointments that we've made. That would be my answer.
So if we took health and community services, which we've already talked about today, could you describe to us or give us assurance that what has happened in practice, what was announced yesterday, was part of the succession plan?
So in that particular instance, of course, we didn't know that we would lose the incumbent in the specific time period we did, and I emphasise lose them for hopefully 3 months, not any longer duration, but these things are uncertain. So in that instance, we'd envisaged that person would finish up their contract, and I think it's March of next year, and that a recruitment process would begin ahead of that this winter. I think one of the things you have to recognise in that situation is that would have been fine if we'd stuck with the existing structure, but we now have a ministerial policy, which is to look at the concept of a whole health system. That whole health system will have a number of different roles within it. It's quite hard to recruit well into a system until you finish consultation and said, this is what I'm recruiting into. So it helps a little bit of a funny one in that at the point where the incumbent is having to go off, we're also at that delicate stage where the new structure's going through consultation. And as I said at the start of my answer, that's one of the reasons I thought the Deputy Chief Executive would be the right person to hold that portfolio while we go through that transition. So that's a fairly unique situation. The CLS situation is very standard. Good succession plans, good internal candidates to step up into that role, and we've triggered that process. But of course, we will then go to a full process in the winter for the permanent replacement.
So if the stability within top civil service team is registered on the risk register?
No, I don't see it as an issue. Okay. In an executive team, you're an executive. If you do well, you get 5 years in a top job. Yeah, exceptional circumstances, you might get extended like COVID or so forth. But when you're a senior executive, you go into a job thinking, if I can't make a difference in 5 years, I shouldn't be here.
I think the 5 years is completely, it's agreeable, nobody discussion when I'm saying on the top
So
currently
therefore, when you have a team of 11, you can expect in any 1 year, there'll be a bit of turnover. And in any 2 or 3 year period, it would be usual in big organisations for the senior leadership to turn over at that kind of rate. I accept in Jersey that's not been usual.
We did have lots of changes
That's
recently.
usual. You've gone from feast to famine, it looks like, over the years, but it's normal to see this kind of turnover. And someone's done 10, 11 years in the job. They've put their stamp in the job. And if they decide that they don't want to do another job in the organisation, then obviously most times people leave in that situation. It gives a new person a chance to put their stamp on it. So I'm not worried about continuity or about the talent we've got around the table, even if they're there on an interim basis.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions and your answers and times. Thank you. The public hearing is closed.
Next meeting.
Yeah, well, doing it by phone, I think.